In 1944, on the battlefields of Normandy, German snipers had a nickname for the American helmet. They called it the steel pot. To them, it was clumsy, too big, too round, too heavy. They mocked the Americans who wore it, saying a single well-placed shot could punch straight through. But that laughter didn't last long. Within weeks of fighting, those same snipers began reporting something strange. Their bullets, clean, accurate, deadly, were glancing off the helmets instead of piercing them. What they thought was cheap metal turned out to be the quiet genius of American design. While the German Stahlhelm looked intimidating, the American M1 was built differently. Its curved shape, its deep brim, its layered steel, all designed not to look good, but to save lives. It could deflect bullets, absorb shock, and even serve as a bowl, a shovel, or a shield. Soon, German prisoners began asking for one to keep as a souvenir, because when they finally saw what that steel pot could endure, they realized the truth. The Americans hadn't just built a helmet. They had built a promise. No soldier fights alone. Before Normandy, the German army believed their equipment was the finest in the world. Their tanks, their rifles, even their helmets were symbols of superiority. The Stahlhelm, that dark, menacing shape, had become the face of the Wehrmacht itself. To German soldiers, it was invincible. To their enemies, it was fear itself. Across the ocean, American engineers had created something entirely different. The new helmet didn't look intimidating. It looked practical. A dull, olive-green bowl of steel with a simple chin strap, nothing elegant, nothing terrifying. Soldiers joked about it before it even reached the front. They called it the steel pot, the tin hat, the bucket. It was heavier than the old model and looked strange in photographs. But hidden in that simplicity was a secret. The American M1 helmet was not designed to impress, it was designed to survive. It was made from a special blend of manganese steel, pressed under extreme pressure, and shaped in a curve that could turn a bullet's energy away rather than absorb it. Its interior liner was removable, allowing the outer shell to take the hit and the liner to protect the skull. No other army had thought of that. German snipers didn't know this when they first encountered American troops in North Africa and later in Europe. From their scopes, the helmets looked like easy targets, wide, bright, and perfectly round. But once they pulled the trigger, they began noticing something odd. The bullet would strike with a spark and skip off at an angle, leaving the soldier stunned but alive. It wasn't luck, it was geometry. Back in Germany, ordnance officers began collecting captured M1s for testing. They fired standard 7.92 millimeters Mauser rounds from different distances. At 100 meters, the bullet sometimes ricocheted. At 200, it flattened. When they increased the angle, the projectile deflected completely. One officer reportedly muttered, "They made a soldier's helmet behave like a tank's armor." Meanwhile, on the Allied side, American soldiers were discovering just how useful their helmet really was. In the mud of Italy, it served as a cooking pot. In the rain of Normandy, it caught water. In the chaos of battle, it shielded men from shrapnel, falling debris, even flying rocks from explosions. The M1 became an all-purpose tool of survival. Soldiers grew attached to it. They painted it, named it, dented it, and trusted it more than anything else they carried. Letters from the front began to circulate stories. Bullets bouncing off, men saved by inches of steel. One report told of a sergeant whose helmet deflected a sniper round, sending sparks flying but leaving him alive. Another described a medic who used his helmet as a basin for blood-soaked bandages, only to have it later stop a piece of shrapnel mid-air. When German troops captured American helmets and tried them on, they noticed the difference immediately. It fit tighter, it covered more of the neck, it felt balanced, almost comfortable. One prisoner remarked, "It feels like it was made by someone who expected to come home." As the war dragged on, the M1 became a quiet symbol of American resilience. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. And in a war where survival often came down to luck, the M1 turned luck into design. By the time Allied soldiers stormed Normandy, hundreds of thousands of these helmets were on their heads. And when German snipers looked through their scopes, they saw those same round shapes they once mocked now leading the invasion of Europe. The laughter was gone. What remained was disbelief. The first time a German sniper realized something was wrong was outside Saint-Lô in the summer of 1944. The town had become a graveyard of stone and smoke. its streets lined with shattered walls and smoldering vehicles. The Americans were advancing slowly, house by house, helmet after helmet glinting in the sunday. From his perch in a church tower, Obergefreiter Franz Müller had a clear shot. He steadied his Mauser, took aim at an American sergeant standing in the open, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. Through his scope he saw the impact, a spark, a spray of dust, and then, to his disbelief, the man ducked, stumbled, and kept running. Müller blinked, confused. He checked his sights. The shot had been perfect. A clean hit. Impossible. He chambered another round and fired again. Same result. The bullet struck the helmet, skipped off, and vanished into the rubble behind. The sergeant dropped to one knee, ripped off the helmet, and stared at it. There was a dent where death should have been. He smiled, then put it back on. Müller sat frozen, his heartbeat louder than the shellfire in the distance. He had seen ricochets before, but not like this. His spotter whispered, "What happened?" Müller muttered, "It's the helmets. They don't die like they should." That night, in the German camp, the story spread like wildfire. Snipers swore they had seen bullets bounce. Some called it luck, others said it was impossible. But when reports came from other divisions, identical accounts, the officers ordered tests. At dawn, a squad set up a firing range behind the lines. They lined up captured American helmets on sandbags and took turns shooting them. At close range, the bullets tore through, but from a distance, the sound changed a hard, metallic ping, followed by silence. One helmet rolled off the pile, dented but intact. The men stared. "Impossible," someone whispered. They tried again, adjusting the angle. Same result, the bullets slid off the curve like rain on glass. When an officer inspected the helmet, he found deep scratches and flattened tips. He held it up to the light and said quietly, "Their steel is softer. It gives instead of shattering." That was the secret. German helmets were forged to be rigid, almost brittle. They were armor protective, but unforgiving. The American M1 flexed slightly under impact, redirecting the bullet's force instead of resisting it. The difference between breaking and bending was life. On the front lines, soldiers began trusting their helmets with their lives. In foxholes, they would flip them upside down to catch rainwater, or press them over their faces during artillery bombardments. Many said they could feel shrapnel hit and roll off, leaving only the echo of what could have been their last breath. In Normandy's hedgerows, a squad from the 29th Infantry took cover under a storm of machine gun fire. One private, crawling through the mud, felt a sudden punch to the head. He thought he was dead. When his buddy pulled him up, he realized the bullet had grazed the rim of his brace. M1 and ricocheted away. "You're the luckiest man alive," his friend said. The private looked at the helmet, smiled weakly, and whispered, "No, I've got the best damn hat in the world." As days turned to weeks, more and more stories spread. Some soldiers sent their dented helmets home to their families, writing notes that said, "This saved my life." Others kept them as trophies, refusing replacements. The dents became badges of honor, proof that the design worked and that survival could be engineered. Meanwhile, in German sniper units, frustration grew. Their rifles were perfect instruments of precision, their ammunition flawless, their training unmatched. But now, even a perfect shot could fail. They adjusted for wind, for range, for movement, and still, the helmets deflected. One sniper cursed. "They've armored their heads." At high command, the rumors reached the top. Military engineers ordered ballistic tests using captured gear. They confirmed what the field already knew. The American M1 had a deflection advantage at medium range. The curvature of its dome and the softness of its steel caused bullets to ricochet rather than pierce. It wasn't indestructible, just smart. And that was enough. In a war where inches decided life and death, a single deflection meant another soldier made it home. The Germans had built fear into their helmets. The Americans had built hope. As Müller prepared for another day in the ruins, he loaded his rifle in silence. His spotter asked if he still aimed for the head. Müller shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "not anymore." By August 1944, the strange stories about the bouncing helmets reached a German testing ground outside Paris. The officers there had no patience for superstition. They gathered captured American gear boots, rifles, webbing, and a pile of M1 helmets and began formal trials. The first test was simple. Place a helmet on a sandbag and fire, from 50 meters. The bullet punched through easily. A few officers smirked. "There, you see," one said. Myth solved. But when they repeated the shot from 200 meters, the tone changed. The bullet hit at an angle, skipped off, and buried itself in a wall behind the range. The helmet spun away, dented but unbroken. The range officer frowned and ordered another round, this time from 300 meters. The bullet struck the crown, flattening at the point of impact. The helmets didn't shatter, they flexed. The tests continued all afternoon. When it ended, the data was undeniable. The American design worked. It didn't need to stop a bullet completely. It only needed to change its path. A report filed that evening summarized the results. The United States helmet design, though crude in appearance, offers notable deflection capacity when struck at glancing angles. Its combination of contour and steel composition provides better survival probability than our model under comparable conditions. The last line said quietly what no one wanted to admit. Recommend study for post-war development. At the front, those conclusions were already written in blood and mud. In the forests outside St. Malo, a sniper duel dragged on for days. An American marksman named Corporal James Fowler was crouched behind a tree line, his M1 rifle balanced on a branch. He adjusted his aim, fired, and moved. A second later, the crack of a Mauser echoed. Bark exploded beside him. Something hot grazed his scalp. He dropped, dizzy, hand to his head, and felt metal. His helmet was ringing like a bell. A clean groove sliced across the top. He laughed in disbelief. "You missed," he whispered to the forest. That night, Fowler scratched a message inside the helmet with his bayonet. Still here. He wasn't the only one. Across Europe, the M1 gained a mythic reputation. Soldiers began calling it the lucky charm. The dents became conversation pieces. In mess tents and foxholes, men compared the scars on their helmets like veterans comparing medals. Each one was proof that the design had done its job. German prisoners often asked to trade for them. "Your helmets? They are different," one said during interrogation. "Our heads feel exposed in ours." The American guard shrugged. "That's the point. Ours are made for living, not posing." Back in Germany, a handful of engineers tried to refine the old Stahlhelm for better deflection. They reshaped the rim, altered the curve, even tested softer alloys. None of it worked. The tooling was too rigid, the resources too scarce, and the mentality too fixed. The German design philosophy demanded perfection. The American one demanded practicality. One made masterpieces. The other saved lives. By autumn, the evidence reached propaganda offices, but it was quietly buried. The Nazi press continued claiming that American equipment was inferior, mass-produced junk. Yet, on the battlefield, reality had already chosen sides. American soldiers marching through France carried their steel pots dented, muddy, and proud. The helmets looked like badges of survival. In October, a Luftwaffe sniper captured near Aachen was asked what he thought of the American army. He answered simply, "They build things to last. Even their helmets fight back." When the Allies crossed the Rhine months later, that comment felt prophetic. The helmets that had once been mocked were now photographed in every victory parade, reflections of steel glinting under grey European skies. Behind every shine was a story of a bullet that didn't finish its journey. In those final months, German snipers stopped aiming for the head altogether. They went for the chest or the legs, anything but that cursed curve of manganese steel that turned death aside like water. The laughter of 1943 was gone. What remained was respect and quiet fear. Winter 1944. The Ardennes was frozen, silent, and waiting for another storm. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. German snipers moved through the forests in white camouflage, their rifles steady, their scopes searching for any flash of green or grey. Across the line, American infantry crouched behind trees and snowbanks, helmets dusted with frost. The same helmets the Germans still called steel pots. One sniper, Feldwebel Otto Reinhardt, had spent 3 years on the eastern and western fronts. He had survived Stalingrad, Normandy, and the retreat through France. He was a perfectionist, proud of his marksmanship and his gear. But by that winter, something inside him had changed. The war was going wrong, and he knew it. His faith in the Reich had cracked, but his pride as a soldier remained. He lay in the snow, his rifle trained on a small clearing where American troops were setting up a radio. One soldier stood up, helmet gleaming faintly under the grey sky. Otto took a deep breath, adjusted his aim, and fired. The bullet hit with a spark. The man stumbled, grabbed his head, and dropped behind cover. Otto cursed, chambered another round, and fired again. Same result, the round skipped off, sending up a puff of snow. Through the scope, he saw the American lift his helmet, shaking his head in disbelief. He was alive. Otto exhaled slowly. "It's happening again," he muttered. His spotter looked at him. "What do you mean?" Otto whispered. "They don't die anymore. They're helmets. They move with the bullets." Later that night, as the Germans fell back under artillery fire, Otto found one of his comrades dead beside a burnt truck, a young man wearing a captured M1 helmet instead of his own Stahlhelm. The American shell that killed him had ripped through his chest, but the helmet was untouched. Otto lifted it from the snow and stared at the curved steel. It was dented, scorched, but still solid. He held it in both hands and whispered, "You're not a helmet. You're a miracle." When his unit retreated toward Germany, Otto kept the helmet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He hung it on his belt like a relic, a piece of proof that what his commanders called inferior was actually superior in every way that mattered. Weeks later, during a final skirmish near Cologne, he was captured. American soldiers searched him and found the M1 still hanging by his side. One guard laughed. "Looks good on you," he said. Otto looked up and replied, "It's the best design of the war." The guard blinked, unsure if he was serious. "You German?" Otto nodded. "Was. Now I am just an engineer who learned a lesson too late." In the prisoner camp, Otto told his story to anyone who would listen. How he had mocked the helmet, how he had fired at it, how he had watched bullets ricochet off like pebbles on stone. The American interrogators wrote it down, surprised by his honesty. "Why did you keep it?" one asked. Otto smiled faintly. "Because it reminds me that sometimes the better design is the one that saves lives, not takes them." When the war ended, Otto returned home to ruins. He became a machinist in a small workshop outside Hamburg. Above his bench hung that same helmet, cleaned but never polished, the dents still visible. He called it his teacher. Years later, when a reporter visited his shop for a story on post-war engineers, Otto told him, "The Americans built a helmet that deflected bullets. We built one that looked good in parades." "That is why we lost," the journalist asked if he still had it. Otto nodded toward the wall. The reporter ran his hand over the cool steel and said, "It's heavier than I thought." Otto smiled. Yes, so was the truth. That truth followed him until his death. The helmet remained where he left it above the workbench, scarred and eternal. Decades later, when his grandson inherited the shop, he found a small note inside, the helmet. The handwriting was faded, but the words were clear. "The bullet that misses because of this is a message from God." By then, the M1 had become a legend, the longest-serving combat helmet in history, used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Its design had changed the world of military protection forever, but for those who had seen its first miracles, it was more than steel. It was the sound of survival, the echo of deflected death, and the quiet proof that sometimes the simplest shape can save the most lives. Spring 1945. The guns were slowing, but the dying hadn't stopped. Across the ruins of Europe, soldiers still crouched behind walls and trees, their helmets the only thing between life and silence. The M1 had been with them from the beaches to the rivers, from the mud of Italy to the snow of Belgium. Now, as the war dragged toward its end, it had become more than gear, it was part of them. On a hill outside Remagen, the smoke from the bridge hung low over the Rhine. American engineers worked furiously under shell fire, reinforcing the structure so tanks could cross. Bullets cracked through the air. A private named Daniel Ruiz ducked behind a truck, helmet ringing from a near miss. The shot left a white groove on the steel, like a scar. He touched it, grinned, and shouted to his buddy, "She's still doing her job," his friend yelled back. "Then keep your head where she can find it." Across the river, a captured German sniper watched through binoculars. His rifle was gone, his pride gone with it. He studied the silhouettes of the Americans crossing the bridge, each one wearing that same green dome. The sight felt like déjà vu, the machine he couldn't beat, multiplied 1,000 times. "They learned to make protection an army," he murmured. The bridge held, the Rhine fell. And when the Americans reached the far bank, many of them carried helmets with fresh dents and scratches, souvenirs written in steel. They had survived artillery, shrapnel, and the worst the Reich could throw at them. Each mark was a story. Each dent was a heartbeat that kept going. After the crossing, an officer gathered the engineers and infantry together. "Take a look at your helmets," he said. "They're ugly now. Keep them that way. They've already stopped more bullets than you can count." The men laughed, tired and proud. No one thought about how much those words would echo decades later. In the following weeks, the front collapsed. Villages surrendered, cities burned, and prisoners flooded the roads. Amid the chaos, an odd ritual appeared. German civilians, seeing the American troops march by, reached out to touch the helmets as if for luck. To them, the dull metal was a symbol of survival, a charm against the madness that had consumed their world. One photograph taken near Nuremberg showed an American medic kneeling beside a wounded child. His helmet, dented and scarred, sat on the ground beside her tiny hand. The image went around the world. For once, a piece of war looked like mercy. By May, the fighting was almost done. In Berlin, under the grey smoke of defeat, a small group of American soldiers stood beside a captured warehouse. Inside, among crates of broken weapons, they found a line of German helmets stacked neatly on a shelf. On one of them, in chalk, someone had written, "Ours looked strong." A corporal picked it up, compared it to his own, and shook his head. "Looks don't stop bullets," he said softly. He set it down, placed his M1 on top, and walked away. For many Germans who survived, that symbol lingered. They had spent years believing fear made a soldier safe. The Americans had proven that confidence, not terror, kept men standing. The M1 wasn't a weapon of domination, it was a shield of faith in human work. When the war finally ended, warehouses across Europe overflowed with those helmets. Some were melted down, others stored for future battles. But thousands went home with the men who had worn them. They hung in closets, barns, garages. Some were polished, others left dirty. Each one carried the sound of a bullet that had changed its mind. Years later, veterans told their children stories of the miracle helmet. They tapped the dents with their fingers, describing the hiss of the shot, the spark, the silence after. And always, the same sentence followed, "That's when I knew I'd live." The design endured. The same shape protected soldiers in Korea, in Vietnam, and even decades later in training fields across America. It became the outline of the modern soldier's silhouette, the curve of endurance, the geometry of hope. Historians still debate how many lives it saved. Some say thousands, others say hundreds of thousands. But numbers miss the point. What mattered was the belief it gave. For every man who felt a bullet strike and still drew breath, that helmet turned fear into faith. One surviving German officer, interviewed in the 1,950 seconds, put it best. "We had the most beautiful equipment in the world," he said, "and they had the most useful. In the end, beauty lost." He paused, looking down at an old M1 displayed on the table before him. "This," he said, tapping the steel gently, "wasn't just armor, it was philosophy. It meant every life was worth designing for." The interviewer asked if he regretted anything. The officer smiled wearily, "Only that I laughed before I understood." The camera faded to black. The old man's reflection lingered on the curved surface of the helmet, 2 generations staring at each other through steel. The sound of distant thunder echoed, like gunfire from another time. And then, quietly, his voice returned, "Some bullets don't miss. They're just told to change direction." When the war ended, the helmets didn't go silent. They went home. On ships and trains, in duffel bags and crates, they followed the soldiers who had trusted them through hell. Some were polished and mounted on mantles, others stayed muddy, hanging from garage walls. Each one was a survivor, scarred, dented, and undefeated. In small towns across America, fathers showed their children the steel that had stopped death. "Right here," they'd say, pointing to a crease or a groove. "That's where a sniper tried to take me home early." The children would run their fingers across the cold metal and ask, "Did it hurt?" The veterans always smiled the same way, only until I realized I was still breathing. For many, the M1 became more than a relic. It was a reminder that design could save lives, that simplicity could outsmart fear. Engineers studied it long after the war, fascinated by how something so ordinary could achieve so much. Its curves became the basis for helmets used by generations of soldiers around the world. Even Germany, rebuilding from ashes, adopted similar principles in their new designs: flexible steel, wide coverage, comfort before aesthetics. The lesson had been learned. In the factories that once built bombers and tanks, American workers now produced cars and appliances. But some of those same machines that had stamped helmets out of steel were kept running just in case. The workers called them the lucky presses. They said, "These saved more men than we'll ever know." The world moved on, but the M1 never disappeared. It crossed the 38th parallel in Korea, sat in the jungles of Vietnam, and appeared in newsreels across decades. Soldiers from different wars, speaking different languages, wore the same shape, proof that the design of survival had outlived the war that created it. In 1962, an old German engineer named Otto Reinhardt, the sniper who once tried to pierce one, visited an American exhibition on wartime innovation. Among the displays was an M1 helmet, its surface scarred, a small plaque beneath it, reading, "This helmet saved Private Daniel Ruiz, 1945. Otto stood there for a long time. The crowd moved around him, unaware of who he was or what he was remembering. Finally, he leaned closer and whispered in German, "Ja, du hast gewonnen. You won." He didn't mean America. He meant the idea that a nation could build not for fear, but for endurance. That the best engineering wasn't what inspired awe, but what preserved life. That night, Otto wrote in his journal, "We built walls. They built shields. That is why their future began when ours ended." By the 1980 seconds, the M1 had become a symbol recognized by the entire world. In monuments, museums, and films, it represented the soldier, not the weapon, not the flag, but the human beneath it. Its simple curve became the shape of memory itself. Every dent carried a whisper. I was there. I lived. Historians would later call it the most successful piece of military design in history. But to the men who wore it, it was something simpler. It was the quiet hum of steel against rain, the ring of impact that ended in relief, the cold touch that felt like safety. One veteran, asked in an interview what he missed most about the war, answered softly, "The sound my helmet made when something hit it and I was still standing." In the end, the M1 outlasted every machine of that war. The tanks rusted, the planes decayed, the guns were scrapped, but the helmet remained, as if it refused to age. In museums it sits quietly, its surface dull, its story bright. Visitors stare at the dents and see more than metal. They see the distance between life and death measured not in inches, but in millimeters of curved steel. And when historians write about the Second World War, about technology, bravery, and design, they often forget that sometimes the smallest invention tells the biggest story. Because this wasn't just about armor. It was about a nation that believed every life deserved protection. It was about engineers who designed with compassion instead of pride. It was about soldiers who went into chaos wearing a promise made of steel. The M1 wasn't a helmet. It was hope, molded and forged, carried into the darkest places on Earth. And long after the last shot was fired, it still echoed with the sound of every bullet that tried and failed to take life away.